Hi, my name is Christina Hildebrandt, and I am the president and founder of A Voice for Choice Advocacy. And we are based in California. We educate and advocate for informed choice and transparency of what goes into your body. And I just got done testifying for AB 1710 in opposition, which would or will allow pharmacists to administer the COVID-19 vaccine even under emergency use. And there are a number of reasons why there's an issue with this. But what I've realized over the past few weeks as I'm watching different bills come forward and I'm watching Congress and Trump put money into Operation Warp Speed, which is the vaccine development agenda on the federal level. And I just feel like there is no way we're going to stop mandated vaccines unless the masses are against them. And in order to do that, we have to wake people up. And what I found is that even in talking to people who were completely pro-vaccine on all other vaccinations, that there is an opening, there's an open door to alerting them to the issues with vaccines, especially on this COVID-19 vaccine. And so I'm putting this out today as sort of an alert that I know we come from all different places on the whole COVID issue. So, there are people that are ardent mask wearers and say that's the way to get rid of this. There are people that won't wear masks at all and say, it's a fundamental right that we have bodily autonomy. Whether this is planned, whether it wasn't planned, but the biggest piece of it, and the one place that I feel like we can come together, is that a vaccine mandate of a not fully tested vaccine is something that we just cannot allow. And with the mask wearing, I see it as, whether you're for or against mask wearing, it is the first step to compliance. It is, you are not allowed to go into stores, you're not allowed to go into restaurants, you're not allowed to fly on planes unless you're wearing a mask. And the next step will be, you're not allowed to do anything without the COVID-19 vaccine. And it will be related to school, to employment, to your driver's license. You can say, well, I live in a place where it's not going to affect me. It's going to affect you. It is going to affect everyone in this world. Even if you live at the end of the earth, it's going to affect you because nobody's going to be allowed into your country or into your island or wherever you live without a vaccine and allowed to travel. So it may not affect you directly. You may not be required to get vaccinated, but it will affect your economy. It will affect your children. It will affect you being able to travel. So I'm appealing to everyone out there that knows the truth about vaccines to educate the people who aren't aware, because this is the silver lining in this whole COVID pandemic. And it is the place that we can make a difference. And if there isn't trust in the vaccines, there isn't going to be the uptake in the vaccines, and there's going to be an inability to be able to mandate them. So let me stop there and let me just go back in a bit of history and a bit of definition so that if you want to forward this, you can do so, and people have the background. So let's go back in history. In history, there are two events that happened. One was in 1976 when President Ford had the swine flu immunization program as a result of the swine flu pandemic, the possible H1n1 pandemic that was possible. And he basically said, okay, we need to get a vaccine as soon as possible. A vaccine was created in 6 months based on a current flu vaccine at the time. And the vaccine manufacturers basically said, we're not going to release it unless you give us no liability. And that's what happened in September of 1976. Over 40 million doses were given in the next 3 months. And then in December 1976, it was actually suspended and pulled off the market because there were a significant number of people that were coming down with Guillain-Barré syndrome, and it was never reestablished, so that vaccine never went back on the market. The next piece of history is in 2009, there was again an H1n1 flu pandemic. This time the European Commission took the first steps there and authorized the H1n1 GlaxoSmithKline vaccine, also based on a flu vaccine, very quickly. They did not complete clinical trials, but because of the possible pandemic, they wanted to get the vaccine out as quickly as possible. And they injected 6 million British residents, and 1 in every 50,000 residents came down with basically their immune system attacking themselves and causing brain damage and permanent narcolepsy. So we've got those two pieces of history where the vaccine was put forward at warp speed, as President Trump is doing, and came out with emergency use authorization and was injected into people and then was pulled because there were so many side effects. Jump forward to 2020, we've got the COVID vaccine. We have a huge amount of money, way more money than either of those being put against it. And I'm just going to look at my notes as I speak to you because I've got it all written down here. But we had $9 billion, with a B, billion dollars being spent by the US government to buy in advance vaccine doses. So that's broken out by, there are 7 leaders in vaccine manufacturing. Some of them are biotech firms, some of them are vaccine manufacturers, but they basically have pre-bought millions, if not billions, of doses of this vaccine. So I'm just going to go through it individually so you can know the numbers. BioNTech and Pfizer, the government has given $1.95 billion, and they have pre-ordered 100 million doses for the end of the year, and they have pre-ordered 500 million doses by 2021. Now, let me just interject there. The US population is 328 million people. 328 million people. So each of these vaccines is likely to be 2 doses. So if you're purchasing 600 million doses of vaccines, you're basically purchasing enough for every single person to get 2 doses in the US right off the bat. Sanofi GSK, they gave $2.1 billion for 100 million doses by the end of the year. Novavax, $1.6 billion for 100 million doses by the end of the year. Janssen and J&J, $1.456 billion, 100 million doses by the end of the year, 500 million next year. AstraZeneca and Oxford, $1.2 billion, 300 million doses by the end of the year. Moderna, $955 million, 600 to 1 billion doses they've said they'll make. There haven't been any pre-ordered by the government. And Merck, IAVI, $38 million, and there's I'll come back to because it's the only oral one that's being given and only will require 1 dose. So as you can see, the fact that the government has pre-ordered basically billions of doses of these vaccines, once a vaccine is made, once they've got it in the vials, it is very unlikely that even if it doesn't work, that they're not going to try and push it through. I mean, there's money involved here. This is a business. These are pharmaceutical companies that want to make money. Period, end of story. Their CEOs come out and say, oh, we're all about philanthropic reasons. We're going to give this away. We're going to charge $3 for it. Whatever the number is, they are going to be making money off this. That's the purpose of it. There's no other reason for a company to go into vaccine manufacturing other than making money off it. Once the doses have been prepared, I mean, they're creating manufacturing sites. Kodak, used to be a film company, is now in the business of making vaccine parts. So syringes, glass bottles, vials, all of those things are being made right now. As we speak, there are manufacturing plants making those items. They're ramping it up. Most of these companies are doing clinical trials. Many of them have not done the animal trials that are required for preclinical testing because we're in an emergency state. They are doing the clinical trials, the phase 2 and phase 3, simultaneously at the same time. Usually the way clinical trials are done, you do animal testing, very, very preliminary. If it makes it through animal testing, and many don't, most don't, then it goes to phase 1. Phase 1 is a very small cohort of about 40 to 50 healthy people. Phase 2 is a slightly larger cohort, and phase 3 is 30,000 people, 15,000 people getting the placebo, 15,000 getting the actual vaccine. And let's just be clear, the placebo is not necessarily a placebo, a saline placebo. It is, in all of these cases, the majority of these cases, a different vaccine. So some are using the pneumococcal vaccine, some are using the meningitis vaccine, and that is what they're testing it against. So it's not against something that is completely benign. It is against something that is not benign. We know those vaccines have side effects. It just basically says that if this vaccine has this many side effects, the COVID vaccine can have as many side effects as that other vaccine, regardless of how much that is. So the clinical trials are running simultaneously, which they shouldn't be. They should go in stages, step 1, step 2, step 3. The step 2 should be published, peer-reviewed first, then it goes on to step 3. We're missing all of that. They're basically just throwing it all out there. And most of these vaccine manufacturers are saying, or biotech firms are saying, that they are going to be done with their trials by the end of this year. Now, if you listen to the people that are usually on the other side of the table from us, Stanley Plotkin, Paul Offit, Peter Hotez, they are saying, whoa, slow down. You cannot do this. You need at least a year after people have gotten the vaccine to determine side effects, to determine efficacy, to determine safety. There's no way we're going to have a year of trials. They will have gotten the vaccination by the end of this year. And as long as they haven't had a side effect in a certain amount of time, they're going to be putting this out for emergency use authorization. So, if anyone thinks that there isn't going to be vaccine mandates and there aren't going to be mass vaccinations, you need to wake up. It's going to be here. The government has purchased vaccines. The other thing that we're seeing, so for example, the bill I was testifying on today, AB 1710, gives pharmacists, so pharmacists normally in California can only vaccinate for vaccines that are on the ACIP recommendations and for children over 3 years old. They are now, if this bill passes, which it seems like it likely will, they will be able to give any vaccine that's approved by the FDA, including emergency use vaccinations. The other piece that we have is also Trump saying that he will get the military to give vaccinations. So, the fact that they're going to push out these vaccinations is 100%. As I said, if you don't believe that, wake up. You will be vaccinated and you will be forced vaccinated, and it will be the same thing as with the masks. It won't be a forced vaccination. It won't be mandated. But in order to get into a restaurant, in order to get into a store, in order to travel, in order to get your driver's license, in order to get your passport, you will need to be vaccinated. So unless you're living, off the grid under a rock, which I think most people are not, you will be forced to get a vaccine in order to live your life in any way, shape, or form. So let's now talk about these vaccines. They're going to come on the market. What can we do about it? The only thing we can do about it is wake people up and talk to people about the COVID vaccine. Even if they are completely pro-vaccine on any other front, people are waking up on this one because there is such a rush to get the vaccine out, and there's a lot of transparency, and there's a lot of press releases, and so people are watching it. And what we can do, knowing vaccine truth, we can educate those people, and at this point, educating them about the COVID vaccine is an open door. It doesn't mean to say they're going to understand the whole vaccine truth, but we can educate them on this one. What can we tell them? What are the key points? How can we get them to understand that they need to be cautious of a COVID vaccine and not just run out and get it? So points are, with the PrEP Act, so the PrEP Act was passed after 9/11, and with the PrEP Act, there is no liability for any product that is created under an emergency situation. So the vaccine manufacturers have absolutely no liability in these vaccines that they're creating, and they will demand no liability. Even if that wasn't the case, they would demand no liability. People that is moving forward the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, basically has said, I don't care about safety. As long as it's effective, I don't care about safety. And she doesn't need to care about safety because she has no liability. It can harm millions of people, and they won't be held accountable for it. So the PrEP Act equals no liability. So you will not be able to sue, no one will be able to sue the vaccine manufacturers or the people giving the vaccines for any form of safety issue. We talked about there's no true placebo. So these vaccines are being tested against other vaccines. They're being tested against other drugs that have not been placebo tested. But there's a great slide that ICANN put out and RFK put out that actually shows that no vaccine is tested against anything other than another vaccine. So they're basically equally as dangerous. Well, if they're really dangerous and everything's equally dangerous, then everything's dangerous, right? Emergency use authorization. So let's go through the process of a vaccine authorization, vaccine approval by the FDA and ACIP. Starts off with the FDA. You can get emergency use authorization for medical products or vaccines that basically, if there isn't an alternative treatment risk and there is a high risk, if there isn't another alternative and you show that it is somewhat effective, then you can get emergency use authorization. You don't have to have gone through the full clinical trials, the full safety and efficacy. You just have to be able to show that this is an alternative and that it possibly can do some good. So if the FDA approves it for emergency use authorization, it can then go on the market. Now, we've seen in the past 2 weeks, there are hundreds of hand sanitizers that were approved for emergency use for COVID, but included methanol and have now been taken off the market because they are basically burning up people's hands. And they were approved emergency use authorization, and it was only after complaints started coming in that the FDA realized, oh, some of these things have methanol in it and they shouldn't, and it's not on the ingredients list, and so we're recalling them and taking them off the emergency use authorization. Same thing can happen for a vaccine. So the vaccine can be approved, the manufacturers say, yep, we think it's effective, we think it's safe, our trials show that, please, put us on emergency use. They're approved for emergency use, and then, months later, once millions of people have been vaccinated, they can be withdrawn and pulled off the emergency use. Another one is hydrochloroquine. That's another one that was put on for emergency use. And then whatever you think of hydrochloroquine, the process was that it was shown not to be effective and it was taken off, but it was put on for a certain amount of time. So just an explanation of the process. Once the vaccines go through the full clinical trials, full safety and efficacy, which usually takes 4 years. The quickest vaccine to the market has been the mumps vaccine, and that took 4 years. So the 4 years, once it gets put on the market and approved by the FDA, then any doctor can give it. They could give it under the emergency use also, but it is, that's basically saying, yes, it's gone through, the FDA has approved it. Usually what happens then within the next 6 months, ACIP, which is the American Committee of Immunization Practices, which is under the CDC, then reviews it and determines who it's recommended for. So are there certain cohorts, age, race, pregnancy, certain profile, whether you're have certain medical issues, that kind of thing. And ACIP then goes ahead and recommends it, or doesn't recommend it. Most of the time they recommend it if it's brought before them. And they then recommend it for the cohort. And at that point, usually, doctors and pharmacists bring it into their practice. Now, because COVID is an emergency, the ACIP actually had a meeting. They usually meet 3 times a year. They had a meeting this year on July 29th as an emergency meeting to discuss COVID vaccines, and they will come back again and have an emergency meeting as soon as a vaccine is approved by the FDA, whether it's emergency use or not. And so, the ACIP and everyone is involved, but those are the usual steps for a vaccine, and this is all being crunched into no time at all. That's another area we need to educate people of an understanding of what an emergency use authorization vaccine is. It means that it has not been fully tested. It has not been fully through the safety and clinical trials. It has not been reviewed by the FDA. It's been reviewed by the manufacturer, and they are saying it's safe and requesting FDA authorization. FDA gives it with very little review and then moves it forward. And the other piece that I remind people when I'm talking to them about vaccines is, these are the same manufacturers for many of these. So we've got Pfizer, Sanofi, GSK, Merck, J&J. These are vaccine manufacturers, but they're also manufacturers of things like opioids, of Vioxx, of the EpiPen. I mean, they had a lot of years of having lawsuits brought against them because of their bad money-grabbing ways. And to think that, you know, they are the devil in those times, but for vaccines, they are, you know, the angels, it just doesn't make sense. They're the same company. They have the same philosophy in the back of their head, which is we want to make money. We want to make money. We don't actually care if people are sick, because if they are sick, we make more money. My ask for you today is to please, if you are aware of the vaccine truth, if you know all these things, if you know that there is no liability, or even if you're just learning about it, spread the word. The fact that there's no liability, the fact that there are no true placebo tests, the fact that it's coming out with emergency use authorization and no real safety testing, the fact that the vaccine manufacturers are the same manufacturers of opioids, Vioxx, all of those drugs that, you know, we would see as terrible, terrible things have done terrible things to our society. Please, please speak up and speak out, because unless we have the masses on our side, there will be vaccine mandates, period, end of story. So I thank you, and please share this. Thank you. Bye-bye.